Somewhere in the ancient forests of West Central Africa, long before kingdoms rose or empires fell, a man lived whose legacy survives not in monuments, but in the quiet code of our chromosomes. We don't know his name. We don't know what language he spoke or what gods he may have worshipped, but we do know this. He carried something no other human alive today carries in quite the same way. A fragment of ancestral fire passed down through suns alone, so old it stretches the limits of what we thought we knew about human history. This is the story of Y-chromosomal Haplogroup A00, a genetic lineage so ancient, so rare, that its discovery in the early 21st century shook the foundations of evolutionary genetics. Until its identification, the earliest known branch of the human Y chromosome tree was thought to be A0. But A00, found not in fossil remains but in the living bodies of men in western Cameroon, predates even that, diverging from all other human Y lineages some 275,000 to 300,000 years ago. This means that the paternal ancestor of A00 lived around the same time, or perhaps even earlier, than mitochondrial Eve, the matrilineal common ancestor of all modern humans. Yet unlike Eve, whose mitochondrial legacy spread far and wide, A00 remained hidden, geographically isolated, statistically rare, and genetically elusive. For decades, no one even knew it existed, and when it finally emerged, it wasn't through an ancient burial site or remote fossil. It appeared in a modern man's DNA test, part of a routine sampling done not by archaeologists, but by a genetic testing company. It was as if the ghost of our deepest ancestry had quietly been living among us the entire time, unnoticed, undisturbed. In this episode, we'll explore what makes haplogroup A00 so special. We'll trace its emergence in West Africa, examine the implications of its deep time divergence, and consider how this rare paternal branch challenges everything we thought we knew about the early human family tree. We'll look at its discovery, its connections to modern populations, especially the Mbo People of Cameroon, and how this lineage helps us piece together the mysterious, fragmented puzzle of early human evolution. A00 is not just a label, it is a whisper from a forgotten chapter in our story, one that tells us the past may be much older, much more complex, and far more interconnected than we ever imagined. Before we can understand the significance of haplogroup A00, we must go far back, long before recorded history, long before agriculture, cities, or civilization. We must travel not only through time, but into the heart of equatorial Africa, to the dense rainforests and highlands of what is today Cameroon. There, among isolated linguistic and cultural communities like the Mbo people, we find one of the deepest roots in the male genetic tree of our species, Y-chromosomal haplogroup A00. The story of A00 begins with a mystery. For decades, geneticists believed that the oldest branches of the human Y chromosome tree were held by hunter-gatherer groups in eastern and southern Africa, particularly the Khoisan-speaking peoples and the Pygmy groups of the Congo Basin. These groups carry Y lineages in the A and B clades, long understood to represent the earliest surviving male lines in Homo sapiens. But all of that changed in 2013, when scientists analyzed a sample from an African-American man living in South Carolina and found something completely unexpected. His Y chromosome did not match any previously known human lineage. It was different, very different. So different, in fact, that it branched off before all other known Y lineages. This discovery extended the age of the Y chromosome family tree by hundreds of thousands of years, and placed the root, what we now call A00, further back than anything we'd ever seen. Subsequent testing traced the origin of this lineage to the Mbo people of Western Cameroon, a relatively small ethnic group living in an area that had not previously been associated with extreme genetic divergence. But what does it mean that the oldest known male genetic lineage is found there? It doesn't mean the first man lived in Cameroon. Rather, it means that this group has preserved an extremely ancient branch of the Y chromosome, uninterrupted by the population expansions and migrations that replaced most other lineages over time. In other words, the Mbo people represent a sort of living genetic archive, a community in which the echoes of early Homo sapiens still resonate in their DNA. To put this into perspective, Haplogroup A00 likely diverged from all other known Y DNA lineages around 275,000 to 300,000 years ago. That's roughly the same period when anatomically modern humans were just beginning to emerge in Africa. At this time, the continent was not a unified population, but a patchwork of small, often isolated human groups, adapting to local environments, hunting, gathering, and living in deep connection with the land. The survival of such an ancient lineage tells us that these isolated populations didn't all die out or get absorbed. Some, like the ancestors of the Mbo, carried their line forward through millennia of climate shifts, population crashes, and migrations. It's likely that this genetic continuity was possible because the region remained relatively stable ecologically and perhaps culturally isolated enough to avoid complete genetic replacement. It also tells us something about how we study ancient DNA. Y-chromosomal lineages are passed strictly through the male line, from father to son. They don't recombine like most of the genome. This makes them powerful tools for tracing deep ancestry, but it also means they are more vulnerable to extinction. If a male lineage dies out, it's gone. So the survival of A00 is both rare and remarkable. It's a remnant of a chapter in our story that otherwise might have been completely erased. Cameroon, in this context, becomes more than a modern nation. It becomes a genetic time capsule. The Mbo people become more than an ethnic group. They are, quite literally, the bearers of one of the oldest known male lineages in human history. In the broader scope of human evolution, this discovery reshapes how we think about early Homo sapiens populations. It suggests that the deepest branches of our species were more widespread than previously thought, and that the roots of our genetic tree may lie not in a single location, but across a wide, interconnected network of ancient populations. Rather than a single Garden of Eden, there may have been many fertile valleys, forests, and highlands where the early chapters of our species played out. The story of A00 reminds us of the fragility and resilience of human lineages. It invites us to listen closely to the genetic whispers still carried by some of the oldest communities on Earth, and to see modern peoples not just as the descendants of survivors, but as stewards of deep ancestral memory. And in the Mbo people of Western Cameroon, that memory runs very, very deep. It didn't begin with a fossil or a cave. It began with a routine test, a cheek swab, a mailer, a lab bench. When the result came back, the Y chromosome profile didn't fit any known branch on the human tree. It didn't sit near the oldest recognized lineages. It sat beneath them, older, deeper, stranger. What looked at first like an error became the opening line of a new chapter. The recognition of Haplogroup A00, a paternal lineage whose split from all others reaches back roughly 275,000 to 300,000 years. How do scientists know a Y lineage is that old? The Y chromosome carries a long stretch called the non-recombining region that passes from father to son mostly unchanged. Over time, single-letter changes called SNPs appear at a slow, fairly regular pace. Map enough SNPs across many men, and you can draw a branching diagram of relatedness, a phylogenetic tree. Calibrate that tree with known archaeological dates and mutation rates, and you can estimate when each branch diverged. A00 sits at the base of that diagram, defined by a set of mutations that no other modern branch shares. It is less a twig and more the oldest visible root. The first surprise was where the trail led, western Cameroon, among the Mbo and neighboring communities in the highlands. This region had not been on the short list of most ancient Y lineages. Attention had long focused on southern Africa's Khoisan and central Africa's rainforest hunter-gatherers. Field sampling in Cameroon changed that picture. Multiple related A00 lineages were identified, not a lone outlier, but a small cluster, hinting at continuity rather than accident. The presence of A00 in a few African American families made sense in hindsight. It likely crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade, a modern echo of a very ancient past. A finding this deep can be easy to misread, so let's clear two common misconceptions. First, A00 does not mean older than humans. It means the Y line that leads to A00's modern carriers split from other modern Y lines very early in our species' history. Second, A00 does not disprove Y-chromosomal Adam. In fact, it refines him. The YMRCA, the most recent common paternal ancestor, sits at the point where all living Y lines converge. When A00 was recognized, that convergence point moved back in time. Adam didn't vanish. He got older. Why would such an ancient line survive in some places and disappear in others? The answer is less dramatic than it sounds: demography. Y lines blink out easily. If a man's sons have only daughters, his Y line ends. If a small population is absorbed by a larger one, older lines can be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. In regions with relative isolation, geographic, cultural, or both, rare lines can persist like heirlooms. That appears to be A00 story, a quiet survival in a corner of West Central Africa, while demographic waves elsewhere favored other branches. The science tightened as more data arrived. High-coverage sequencing confirmed that A00 carries a long run of unique SNPs and downstream subdivisions. A00 subclades helped sketch a finer map within the branch. Each subclade marks a more recent split, a sign that the lineage didn't just freeze in time. It changed slowly along its own path. Meanwhile, comparisons with other early branches, A0, A1, A1b, and the BT clade that ultimately fathers most non-African Y lineages, helped position A00 precisely. Not above, not outside, but earliest among equals in the modern human Y tree. The implications ripple outward. First, Africa's genetic landscape is older and more structured than a single cradle narrative suggests. Multiple small populations, separated by ecology and distance, carry different slices of early human diversity. Second, deep structure in our past, long-lived regional groups exchanging genes intermittently, can leave surprising footprints. A00 is one such footprint, proof that some early male lines endured in place while others rose, expanded, and vanished. Third, modern sampling matters. We overlook hidden chapters when we undersample the continent that holds most of our species' history. And then there's the human meaning. In one sense, A00 changes nothing about your day-to-day life. In another, it changes everything about the story we tell ourselves. It reminds us that the beginning is broader than we thought, that early humanity was a mosaic of neighboring lights in the dark rather than a single campfire. It shows how easily rare lines can be lost and how much is saved when even a few people keep a thread unbroken. Picture a researcher in a lab, watching a tree on the screen redraw itself as new SNPs click into place. A line drops lower than any seen before. A test returns from Cameroon and lands in the same deep band. Another follows. A pattern emerges where an error once seemed likely. At some point, the data stops being surprising and becomes history, not the kind carved in stone, but the kind carried in blood. If you come from a population that carries A00, that doesn't make you more ancient than anyone else. It makes your paternal thread more visible at the root. If you don't, your story is no less deep. You're tied in through other branches, all of which meet at the same point in the past. That's what a common ancestor means. We meet there, every line, every leaf. So what did A00 change? It stretched our timeline, widened our map, and quieted our certainty. It reminded science to keep listening in places it hasn't listened enough. And it gave us a rare gift, a living link to the earliest chapters of the human male line, preserved not in bone or rock, but in the quiet fidelity of a chromosome that refuses to recombine, that simply moves forward, father to son, until the present reaches back and finally recognizes it. The consequences of discovering a lineage as old as A00 unfold in layers. The first layer is simple chronology. The human male line is older than we thought. That alone forces models to stretch, timelines to shift, and comfortable narratives to loosen. When a branch plunges deeper than every other known line, it tells us the beginning of our paternal story was not a thin, singular moment, but a broader band of time, an era crowded with small populations that were more isolated, more diverse, and more persistent than we had imagined. The second layer is geography. A00 surviving in the highlands of Western Cameroon means the early mosaic of Homo sapiens wasn't just a Southern or Eastern African event. Deep roots also ran through West Central Africa, and some of those roots never got pulled up by later demographic waves. The third layer is method. The lineage was found not in a cave, but in a person, living heritage revealing what the rock record never could. That changes how and where we look. From a scientific standpoint, the discovery nudges the out-of-Africa story toward a more nuanced shape. The old clean line, one origin, one dispersal, has been replaced by a braided river. In that river, channels split and rejoin, eddies hold old water for a very long time, and side streams carry something ancient far downstream. A00 is one of those side streams. It reminds us that Africa contained multiple refugees where lineages could persist while others rose and fell. Climate shifts likely carved this pattern. During wetter pulses, forest and savanna expanded, populations touched and mixed. During dry spells, habitats shrank, groups retreated to ecological islands, uplands, gallery forests, river corridors, where distinctive lines could endure. A00 testifies that some of those islands lasted long enough to ferry a very old paternal thread straight into the present. It also tightens our humility about sampling. For years, the deepest Y lineages were assumed to be concentrated among particular Southern or Central African communities, and many studies sampled accordingly. Then a routine test flagged an outlier in the United States, and fieldwork followed the signal back to Cameroon. The lesson is plain. Hidden chapters in the human record often sit where we have not yet asked the right questions. Each new survey of understudied groups can redraw the tree. That is not a weakness of genetics. It is its strength. The map updates as the data deepens. The lineage's survival illuminates population mechanics in a way textbooks rarely do. Y-chromosome lines are fragile. They vanish if sons do not have sons. They are swamped when a few successful males leave many descendants. They can be replaced in a few dozen generations by a migration or a conquest. The continued existence of A00 means that, in one region at least, demographic churn was slow enough, or social structures were stable enough, that the oldest branch was never pruned to the ground. It also suggests that later expansions, pastoralists, farmers, and much later colonial forces did not entirely overwrite the local paternal tapestry. Some threads escaped the loom. If you step out of genetics and into anthropology, the implications continue. A00's presence among the Mbo and neighboring communities does not make anyone more ancient in culture, language, or identity. It makes their paternal thread an excellent archive. That distinction matters. The past survives in people without defining them. A language, a style of music, a ritual, a kinship rule, these are living choices, remade in each generation. A Y lineage is simply a silent courier. The ethical frame, then, is about stewardship and respect, sampling with consent, explaining findings clearly, and resisting the urge to turn populations into symbols. A00 should not be a banner or a brand. It is a clue. Science has to hold that line. Medicine and forensics feel the ripple too. Mitochondrial and Y markers first entered public awareness through Ancestry testing, but they have practical force. In medicine, population structure influences how we search for disease-associated variants and how we interpret risk across groups. The deeper and more varied Africa's genetic landscape proves to be, the more important it becomes to include African and African diaspora genomes in clinical research. When we undersample, we misestimate risk, we miss drug response signals, and we mistake normal variation for pathology. In forensics, a richer Y tree sharpens or softens probabilities in ways that matter in courtrooms. Knowing that very old lineages persist in some regions changes the prior assumptions baked into matches and exclusions. The answer is not fear. It is precision. Better databases, broader reference panels, more careful language about what a probability can and cannot say. For history, A00 opens a window onto the deep structure of Africa before agriculture. Paternal lines often travel with social rules, patrilocal residence, bride wealth, clan names, and with technologies, herding, metalworking, that amplify certain Y branches. When we find a branch that predates those innovations, we're peering into an era when smaller bands leaned on local ecologies and kinship ties. It doesn't tell us the songs or the stories, but it fixes a point. People here held this thread while the world changed around them. Later movements, Bantu expansions, Sahelian states, Atlantic trade, layered new patterns on top, but the oldest layer did not entirely disappear. That layered view, in which old and new persist together, is a better fit for how cultures actually move through time. There is also a philosophical edge. Discoveries like A00 complicate the idea of a single beginning. We crave origins because they feel tidy. They offer a moment to point at and say, "There, that's where we started." But life is messy, and so are lineages. Mitochondrial Eve is not the first woman, and Y-chromosomal Adam is not the first man. They are coalescence points, mathematical meeting places where surviving lines converge. Push a branch deeper, and the meeting place moves. Nothing in your body changes. The story simply gets more honest about its breadth. The past is not a pin on a map. It is a field with many gates. For creators and teachers, A00 is a gift. It turns an abstract lesson, mutation rates, trees, coalescence, into a human story, a family in Cameroon, a test in a lab, a surprise that sent scientists back into the field. It's a reminder to students that science is provisional and alive, and that a discovery doesn't close a question. It opens 5 more. It's a reminder to audiences that Africa is not a backdrop, but the main stage, with regions and peoples whose contributions to human history are not footnotes, but foundations. And for individuals, especially those in the African diaspora, A00 offers a quiet kind of anchoring, not the empty thrill of the oldest, but the steadier feeling that some threads in the tapestry have been held for a very long time. For many, the rupture of records across oceans has made roots feel abstract. Genetic findings cannot restore names and places, but they can say, truthfully, Parts of your story are older than pyramids, older than deserts crossed and ships launched. Some of those parts still live in people whose language and land remember the same hills and rains. What should we not do with A00? We should not rank lineages or treat them as metals. Deep does not mean better. Common does not mean worse. Evolution is not a ladder. It is a tree, and trees need both roots and leaves. We should not claim that one region is the origin of mankind because one lineage survived there. Survival of a line tells you about history's pathways, not about worth, and we should not stop looking because we found something remarkable. If the earliest known branch was missed until a decade ago, what else is still hiding in plain sight? The practical next steps are straightforward. Sample more, especially in regions long overlooked. Pair genetics with linguistics, archaeology, and oral history, because no single discipline carries the whole truth. Build partnerships with communities so that studies answer questions locals care about and share benefits fairly. And educate. Explain what a lineage is and is not, so that people can claim their past without being caged by it. In the end, the legacy of A00 is clarity without finality. It clarifies that Africa's past is richer and more reticulated than any single map can draw. It clarifies that very old lineages can live quietly inside modern identities. It clarifies that science advances not just by finding new things, but by looking again at familiar places with better tools and broader respect. And it refuses finality, because every added branch on the tree invites us to look for another. Think of the Y chromosome itself, a record that does not recombine, that walks a narrow path from father to son. It remembers little, just enough to mark the miles. A00 is one of those mile markers, almost at the start of the road. It does not tell you where to go next, but it tells you there was a before longer than we thought. The road behind us is longer. The road ahead, if we keep listening, is wider. And that is why a single, rare lineage can matter so much. Not because it crowns anyone as oldest or closest to the source, but because it keeps the story honest. It keeps the beginning open. It keeps the tree alive. We set out to find a single branch, and we found a doorway. Haplogroup A00 doesn't hand us a tidy origin. It shows us how wide the beginning really was. A line that slipped past extinctions and conquests reminds us that history is not only what survives in stone, it's what survives in people. In the Mbo highlands, in families carried across oceans, a quiet thread of the first pages is still being read by living cells. If you hold that thought, a few things shift. Africa stops being a backdrop and becomes the main stage, layered and local, full of refugees where old lines could rest and then continue. Origins stops being a pin on a map and becomes a field with many gates. And Ancestry, yours, mine, stops being a contest for the oldest label and becomes what it has always been, a shared path with many starting points that meet sooner than we think in one human story. A00 doesn't make anyone more ancient, and it doesn't make anyone else less. It makes our timeline longer, our map larger, and our questions better. It asks us to sample where we haven't, to listen where we didn't, to teach with care, and to treat communities not as artifacts, but as partners. It asks us to remember that the tools we use to read the past can also shape a fairer future, when medicine, forensics, and history include everyone the way they should. So take one last look at that tree we've been building. Down among the roots, almost at the first fork, a small marker reads, A00. It's not a crown, it's a milepost. It tells us there was a before, longer than we guessed, and that the next answers live in the next branches. In the following episode, we'll climb to those. A0 and A1, the early forks that lead toward BT, the great paternal trunk from which most of the world's Y lineages grow. We'll see what changed in the code, where those changes took hold, and how they set the stage for the migrations that carried our species across deserts and seas. Until then, remember, the line that binds us is older than any line that divides us, and somewhere, in a small inheritance passed from father to son, the first pages are still turning.